The presentation is based on some stories and on the book Company-Wide Agility with Beyond Budgeting, Open Space, and Sociocracy, Survive and Thrive on Disruption, that I wrote with Jutta Eckstein, who's in Germany. And it's about creating and sharing probes for nourishing learning. So we held a Narrathon recently, and the Narrathon was about how to probe, and I'll explain in a minute what that is. It was almost everybody participating was from India, and it was the first time we'd tried teaching how to probe to handle complexity, and I'm wanting to report on the results of that Narrathon. So it had two goals. One was to learn how to bring a culture of experimentation to your company, and the second was understanding how probes can nourish our collective learning. And I'll give you some of the comments that we had at the end of it. It did seem like it did provide a learning atmosphere. And we'll, if you want, point you to things you can do to experiment with probes if you want. So the sort of the beginning thesis is that we live in volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous times, or VUCA. In Spanish, that's VUCA. And this was done just before the virus started hitting, and the virus is proving that we live indeed in VUCA times, more so than we knew at the time we were doing it. It's hard being real interactive with this, but I'm guessing that most of you know about an approach to understanding complexity called Cynefin by Snowden. And very briefly, it says if you have a simple situation, you just kind of study it and maybe create some categories and respond according to the categories. Like, is it time for lunch? Well, yes, it's noontime. So we have 5 restaurants we could go to or cook, whatever. We like this restaurant the best. That's the kind of thinking you do there. Complicated is when you have something like an airplane or a car where you have to have a specialist to help you with the system that you're dealing with. But in the end, you can find a blueprint that tells you what wire on what wing is causing a problem. And you just have to find that and analyze it before you try to fix your problem. It can be engineered, even if it's complicated. What we find, particularly when we're dealing with human beings, is something that's called complexity, or it's complex. And complex means that there's no way to get a blueprint out that lets you know what is happening. You may not know, and probably don't know, what's really causing and what's really the effect. The cause and effect breaks down. So you can identify some sort of practice or pattern. You've probably heard of chaos theory, but actually it's really complexity theory, because you'll end up with patterns in the system that you can identify. You can even replicate it with mathematics. So you have to probe first, and that's going to be the subject of what we're talking about. What's a probe? How do you deal with complexity? It's not over here trying to observe and analyze. It's finding out what's going on. Chaos is when all hell's breaking loose. There's a fire in the house. You just act and then make sense of it later. And I won't try to go into all the details about disorder and all that sort of thing. But this is the framework that we're talking to you from, is this: how do you find out what's going on so that you can try to make some sense of it and figure out what to do. There's what we're looking at today, probe. So a probe is can be confused with an experiment, and the distinction maybe is kind of subtle. But basically, it starts out with you thinking about your situation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go down. But that's a special kind of thing where you try not to come in with some kind of preset framework. You do what's called reflexive inquiry, meaning thinking about how we're thinking. And that's the beginning of your probe. You design the probe saying, what do we do about this? What's something new we could do? you develop hypotheses and design an experiment. So by probing, we mean this. You can actually publish your probe. Let's say you go ahead and do your experiment. Once you've done the experiment, the results of that experiment should cycle back up to your reflection process, your periodic reflection, which can be a circle meeting, by the way. And in fact, circle meetings are ideally made to reflect on your situation. You also are, whoops, this didn't do what I wanted. There we go. It's important to publish to your peers. Now, your peers can be other people in the company, where you can talk about just the probe that you designed, or you can talk about the probe and the experiment. And it can be outside of your company. And that's what scientists do all the time. And the reason you do that is so that they can tell you, gee, we tried that and this is what happened. And you can think about how much more do we learn from our friends, and think again about your situation. So this is the cycle. We'll be looking at this again in a moment. I'm going to give an example of a probe here. It's a German company, although this is written in English. It's an example of a travel voucher that you may be familiar with if you've worked for a large company, where you're supposed to conform to very preset guidelines as to what you do and keep track of your parking and all these other sorts of expenses and meals, and give the total and turn it in and have it reviewed by somebody who says, well, we disallow that parking because you parked there for 3 hours rather than 2 according to regulation, and so on. A very burdensome process. So they decided to probe this one time, and they asked, let me go down here, is trust cheaper? What if we just didn't, these traditional expense procedures are burdensome and they assume people can't be trusted, which is interesting. You might have a multi-million-dollar budget, but by golly, when you travel, we don't trust you. So they said, what happens if we assume that such procedures cost more than they save and are demoralizing? We will try an experiment that says, or our hypothesis is that by not having all these procedures, we can save money. So your experiment might be doing a pre-survey and an audit. How much is it costing us, both in the auditor's time and people's time, to do all this stuff? And with a few units, try changing the travel rules, and then survey afterwards what happened. They did this, and they just, for the experimental groups, they came up with 3 rules. If you need to travel, be economically sensible, like, just whatever you judge that to be. And make sure what you do is legal, and take care of yourself. And so they tried this, and it was so successful that they adopted it in the whole company. So I'll go back to this train here. My slides are not cooperating. Here we go, the train. This was done in Germany. The Germans travel a lot by trains. And it turned out that the president of the company usually traveled second class on the train. But there was a portion of the company that traveled first class. And it turned out that people naturally separated themselves into 2 categories. One was for the people who were consulting and were on the road all the time, and they needed to take care of themselves. And then there was everybody else who went second class. So they did save money, and it differentiated the company into the types of travel that they were doing. Everybody self-organized around it. So that's an example of designing a probe, trying an experiment, taking the results of the experiment and expanding it. So just when we did this Narrathon, again, we had people learn about all these different steps. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about things we taught them about reflecting and designing probes. But to keep this more fun, I would like you to take a minute now and just think about, what's a situation either in my work or in my family or in the way I'm running my personal life, if I'm a sole proprietor, just something that you're doing that you wonder about, could we do it differently? And I'll be asking a little bit later for you to share kind of what your thoughts were. So literally, we're going to be silent for 90 seconds, which may seem like a long time when I say go. And I would like you to just sit and think and jot down what you might think about, and we may share it by chat in a little bit, but just so that you can be making this real for yourself. So take now, starting now, take 90 seconds just to take a breath and just think about all the different things that are happening in your life or your company, and think, I wonder why I'm doing that, or could this be done in a different way? And again, I do recommend taking a deep breath and just feeling the air coming in and how the air feels going out, and do it again, just to step away from the way you're normally doing things. We'll take about another half a minute. Take another breath, that really conscious breath. Okay, so let's go on a little bit here. This is what we did here, reflecting on our situation. Again, this is the perfect use of a circle, a sociocracy circle. And sort of things that you might have been asking yourselves is, can we think about what we're assuming? What would it be like if we didn't make that assumption? In general, you shouldn't, when you're reflecting on your situation, focus on something broad and big. I can't see everybody, and I don't want to try to switch over to see hands raising, but I imagine some of you may have thought of some great big thing. You might, if you did that, want to kind of think, how can we do something smaller? It's more likely to be useful to yourself and others, something that you can really control. If you're at a big organization, you can still experiment with small things. And you can ask yourselves questions like, what am I challenged by? What am I not challenged by? What might be the cause of being challenged? What would be, what's the difference between what's challenging and what's not? Asking what's different is a very powerful tool to be thinking about your situation. So if you remember, the next thing that we asked was, okay, let's design a probe. And go ahead right now for yourselves and ask yourself a question that reflects your hypothesis. The hypothesis is, what if we did this? Or I wonder if that's true. We're always thinking it's true. And so write down a question that reflects your hypothesis. What happens if I don't always have a big breakfast? Does it really mean that I'll feel upset for the rest of the day? Or, that's a very simple question. And take another moment to jot down your context. What's the background of it? Well, I'm saying something about breakfast because I'm trying to lose weight. And what's around that? And so take a moment as I'm talking to write that out and come up with a hypothesis. If I don't eat breakfast, I will feel fine during the day. It's the hypothesis should be observable. So maybe I'll have a scale of 1 to 10. How am I feeling at this moment? And I'll jot down that scale once each hour. I'll set the hour alarm on my watch, and when that goes off, I'll write how I'm feeling. And I'll design the experiment such that I have a measure beforehand. Okay, today I'm going to take this, I'm going to eat a full breakfast, I'm going to jot down during the day how I'm feeling. And then the next day you do the experiment, no breakfast, and jot down how you're feeling. And then it would be good maybe the next day to go ahead and eat breakfast and see, do you see a difference, so that you have some way of measuring. It's got to be safe to fail. If I'm really feeling terrible, then I'll go ahead and eat. But it's only if I stay in a relatively comfortable situation, or I'm not going to do it when I'm presenting at the SOFA conference, because I want to be in great shape. I did have breakfast this morning. So jot down that sort of thing. This is the sort of thing that we were doing in the Narrathon. We had 4 sessions in the Narrathon, and we started out asking everybody to do just what you're doing right now. And then we spent the next, we spaced it out over several weeks, and with a largest amount of time in between the second and third sessions, so people could go out and actually try their experiments. But we started out this way, and then we started refining what they were doing. So here are just a couple of things. One is the name of your probe should be a question reflecting your hypothesis. So in this case, my experiment might have been, does the day go better, or does the day go okay or better without breakfast? And the background, this shouldn't be an obvious question. And so you probably, in coming up with your hypothesis and experiment, you should do some background research, so that you're not just reinventing something everybody knows about. This is kind of like the back end of the loop, where you're asking your peers to tell you what they're doing, and you're telling them. It should be observable. Even if it's a subjective scale, there's ways to estimate things. It doesn't have to be super rigid, but it does have to be observable. And what you're doing should be fact-based, as opposed to speculating about things. So you want to be using the facts, the things that you're researching as part of a pre-measure for your experiment. So I'm going to stop at this point, because the next thing is to tell you about some of the things that we helped people learn about. And I'm just curious to know what at this point is to have you come up with. So if you could take a few moments to record in the chat what you've done at this point, maybe a few lines, or at least a summary of what you're doing, that would be great. I would love to see that. I like the one, what happens if I keep working from home? But let's see. Will I feel less stressed if I regularly take time alone for myself? Will a child cooking a meal with support lead to more cooking and other chore work? Will cooperation generalize? I like these because they're very specific. If we reflect the board of the company transparently to the organization, would it bring value to the organization as a whole? That one might be more difficult to study. Gabby, what on your question there? What will we reflect the board of the company? What hypothesis were you thinking of there? If you don't mind me putting you on the spot. If you don't want to discuss this, just go ahead and say so. But if you would be willing, I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about what you were thinking there, because I'm worried that it might be too big.
Sure. So the case is, and again, sticking to the facts, that the organization I'm thinking about has got reflected the company as a whole. So there are circles, the accountabilities, the purposes, everything is transparent. The only part of the organization that stays kind of hidden and it's not transparently open is the board still. So the anchor circle, we could call it as well, right?
Okay.
So that's what my hypothesis is getting into. So what if we reflect the board to the company, to the organization transparently? Would it bring value to the organization as a whole? Or is it unnecessary,
right,
effort, etc., right?
So would it be something like that you're, okay, so your hypothesis is that if you make the board transparent, it'll bring some sort of value to the organization.
Correct.
So what we were doing in the Narrathon would be, we would take something like this and we would ask questions. So for example, I would say, how would you measure that there was value brought? What would be something that you could observe?
Yeah, so kind of indicators, right?
Right, and you may or may not know that right now, but I'm just trying to give everybody an example of the sort of thing that you, as you reflect about your probe, you can find ways to improve it, because we started everybody doing this in the very first session, and then we spent 3 more sessions refining things. So that would be one question, like organizational commitment is something you might be able to do. And then so your hypothesis would be something like, if we publish the minutes of the board meeting, then organizational commitment will go up. And you could measure, there's ways like with a sociological survey to measure organizational commitment before and then after, and see what happens.
Thanks, Dr. Rose. I see what you mean. It goes much more deeper and more into the concrete.
Exactly what you're doing, right? So that and there's all sorts of questions on that about organizational design. For example, if you do it that way, you don't have a control group, and I'll discuss, briefly what that is. A control group is when you have something that's relatively similar to what you're experimenting with, so that you can compare what's happening. And so, for example,
A/B testing, is this what you mean?
Well, like A/B testing, sure. Like in the example I gave of the German company, they only took a few of the units first, and they kept the old rules for the rest of the company, but they just saw what happened with the experimental units. And they actually did have sessions where they talked about travel expenses or something. So they were doing things on both sides, and they were able to see a clear difference in what they were measuring, that the costs, among other things, were going down. So when you're dealing with the board, that would be a challenge. Well, how do you deal with that? Is there a way to do control groups? If not, then you have to be really careful about before and after.
Yeah, thanks. That helps a lot, Jerry. Thank you.
Okay, so we don't have time to go through all these, but that's the process we used in this Narrathon with the folks in India, is that kind of questioning, that kind of asking them to rewrite, getting together and sharing their probes. There's lots of group learning that can happen. In the next sessions, we looked at the impact of complexity, experimental design. We went into much more depth about it. One of the things that's most difficult is the difference between correlation and causation. And I want to ask if anybody has ever heard of the Hawthorne effect. Well, we don't have time for too much interaction here. I'll just tell you what it is. The Hawthorne effect refers to the Hawthorne electrical plant in the 1930s in Hawthorne, Illinois. And they were making light bulbs, and they started thinking, well, what would happen to productivity if we started increasing the amount of light in the factories? So they measured their productivity at a certain point, and then they increased the amount of light and productivity went up. And they increased the amount of light and it went up again. And they increased it a third time, and productivity kept going up. until when they did it the fourth time, you could hardly see. It was so bright in the place. And they thought, let's check this a little bit. Let's start reducing the amount of light. So they reduced the amount of light and productivity went up. And they reduced it some more and productivity went up. And they got it back to the original level and productivity was way high. And that's the Hawthorne effect. It was the people liked being measured and getting attention. And that's what was affecting productivity. It didn't have anything to do with the level of lighting. And so causation and correlation is very tricky. I could give you lots of evidence that storks bring babies. If you look at these, compare this number of sightings of storks to the birth rate, it goes up, they correlate. Does that mean causation? No. So you have to think through those kinds of issues. And one of the main reasons for having control groups is to try to control the Hawthorne effect. You study both groups so that you know you have that as a common thing so that you can isolate what you're trying. So the results of the Narrathon are here I encourage you to go here. Actually, I'm just going to flip over here. This was a screen capture from the Narrathon. We learned lots of things. Here's the probe cycle. We were happy that we had people really seemed to like what was going on. You can see some of the comments here about that they liked it. Hang on, let me go over to here. Here we go. When I joined the Narrathon, I never thought it would be such an incredible learning journey. So this actually can be exciting stuff. And I encourage you to go to the agilebosanova.com site and look in the blogs. Here is Ashish's probe. He had an abstract. He had a question: what happens if we don't have the boss be in a retrospective? This was a software group, and described his background, his hypothesis, designed a very detailed experiment, looked at the kind of measures he was making, the number of velocity points they had, issues reported, and as expected, he actually ran the experiment. If the boss was not there, people weren't afraid of what they were talking about being used in the performance review. And so he showed all this, and he said the next steps were to be working with the manager and the team to see if they brought the manager back with different instructions about what he was supposed to be doing, whether the retrospective would still continue to be more successful or if it would go down. And he says he was getting this published on our webpage here, and we invite you to send us reports on probes you do, because we're trying to encourage people to have a place to go to look at their probes. And there's lots of different probes that are here. So that was the end effect of that. And I want to thank you so much for staying, for listening, and please stay in touch. Here's some ways to get hold of us. And finally, if you want to participate in a Narrathon yourself, if you go to the tiny.cc site, just type in Narrathon 2. It's starting on June 26th.